The blizzard arrived without ceremony, a tyrant descending from the gray skies to lay siege to the mountain. For 2 days, it had raged, erasing the world in a swirling vortex of white. Inside his small, sturdy cabin, Dr. Elias Vance watched the storm and felt a familiar quiet settle over him. He had long ago made peace with solitude. At 72, his world had contracted to the walls of this house, the vast library of books he had collected over a lifetime, and the steady, sleeping presence of his only companion. That companion, a magnificent old bloodhound named Buster, now lay sprawled on the thick sheepskin rug before the stone fireplace. Buster's great, wrinkled face was grizzled with gray, and a low, arthritic groan escaped his lips every time he shifted his weight. He was 14 years old, an ancient age for a dog of his size, and his days were mostly a peaceful rotation of sleeping, eating, and sighing with a profound worldly contentment. He was, Elias often thought, the quiet, furry soul of the house. Elias had been a physician for 40 years, a man of science and logic. He diagnosed, he treated, he understood cause and effect. Now, in his retirement, he applied that same logic to his life. His wife, Martha, was gone, taken by an illness 5 years ago that even he, with all his skill, could not stop. The silence she left behind was a symptom of his new reality, and he treated it with a quiet routine of reading, tending the fire, and conversing softly with his old dog. It was in a momentary lull in the storm's fury, as the wind drew a breath before its next assault, that he heard it. It was a sound so faint, so high-pitched, it was almost not a sound at all. A thin, reedy cry, carried on the wind. Elias paused, his teacup halfway to his lips. He tilted his head, listening. The wind picked up again, shrieking around the eaves of the cabin, and the sound was gone, swallowed by the gale. He set his cup down. It was nothing. The wind playing tricks, whistling through a crack in the window frame, or perhaps a snowshoe hare, caught by a predator. The mountain was full of small, brief tragedies. He picked up his book, the leather cover worn smooth by his own hands and Martha's before him. He tried to find his place on the page, but his mind snagged on the memory of the sound. It had been disturbingly familiar. There, it came again. A little clearer this time. A wavering, desperate cry that sliced through the howl of the wind. A baby. It sounded impossibly like a baby crying. Elias closed his eyes, a familiar ache blooming in his chest. He and Martha had never been able to have children. It was the one diagnosis that had personally failed him. In their younger years, the silence of the cabin had been a source of shared sorrow. Now, in his old age, it was just a fact of life. Phantoms, he thought. The wind was making phantom sounds, and his lonely old heart was giving them a name. He was a man of science. Babies did not cry in the middle of a blizzard on a deserted mountain. It was illogical, impossible. It was an auditory illusion, a trick of acoustics and grief. Buster, who had been snoring softly by the fire, suddenly lifted his great, heavy head. His long, velvety ears perked up. A low rumble started deep in his chest. He was listening, too. The old dog looked over at Elias, his brow wrinkled, his deep brown eyes filled with a questioning intelligence. "It's just the wind, old boy," Elias said, his voice a little too loud in the quiet room. "Go back to sleep." But Buster didn't go back to sleep. He pushed himself to his feet with a groan, his old joints protesting the movement. He walked to the heavy oak door, his nose pressed against the crack at the bottom, sniffing the frigid air that seeped in. The sound came again, a desperate, fading wail. Elias set his book down for good. A cold, unsettling feeling began to creep up his spine. He was a logical man, yes, but he had also learned, over a long life, to trust the instincts of his dog. And right now, Buster's instincts were screaming that something was wrong. He tried to reason it away one last time. It was a mountain cat, a vixen, an animal of some kind. Any explanation was more plausible than the impossible one. But the sound, faint and fragile as it was, did not sound like any animal he had ever heard. It sounded like a human child, and it was a sound of pure, undiluted misery. Elias tried to force the sound from his mind. He poured himself another cup of tea. The familiar ritual, a small anchor in his growing unease. He stoked the fire, sending a shower of bright orange sparks dancing up the chimney. He sat back down, opened his book, and stared at the words. But they were just black marks on a white page, meaningless. His entire being was attuned to the storm outside, and to the strange, insistent behavior of his dog. Buster did not settle. The old bloodhound began to pace the length of the room, a restless, anxious patrol. His nails clicked a worried rhythm on the wooden floorboards. It was a slow, stiff-legged pace, each step a clear effort for his arthritic joints, which made the action all the more significant. He would walk from the hearth to the door, press his wet nose to the threshold, and then turn and walk back, his deep-set, sorrowful eyes fixed on Elias. "Settle down, boy," Elias murmured, trying to keep his own voice calm. "There's nothing out there but trouble." Buster ignored him. He went to the door and scratched at it. Not a playful tap, but a deep, demanding scrape of claw against oak. He let out a low whine, a sound thick with an urgency that vibrated through the cabin. He looked over his shoulder at Elias, his gaze intense, pleading. There was no mistaking his meaning. "We have to go. Now. Don't be a fool." "Buster," Elias reasoned with the dog, as he had done for 14 years. "It's a blizzard. You're an old man. I'm an even older one. We are staying where it is warm." The cry came again on the wind, thin and sharp. In response, Buster did something he hadn't done in years. He threw his head back and let out a single, deep, mournful bay. It was not the excited sound of a dog on a scent, but a cry of profound distress. A sound that seemed to say the world was broken and he was the only one who could fix it. That sound shattered the last of Elias's rationalizations. He had known this dog since he was a clumsy, drooling puppy. He knew every sigh, every groan, every twitch. And he knew this sound. It was the sound Buster made when he had found something of immense importance, something that mattered more than his own comfort or safety. To ignore that call would be to deny the 14 years of unwavering loyalty and companionship that had defined their lives together. It would be a betrayal. "All right," Elias sighed, his voice resigning to the inevitable. He closed his book and slowly pushed himself out of his chair, his own old joints groaning in sympathy with his dog's. "All right. You stubborn old mule. You win." Buster's response was immediate. He stopped whining, his tail giving a single powerful thump against the floor. He stood by the door, quivering with anticipation. As Elias began the laborious process of preparing for the storm, he pulled on layers of thermal clothing, thick wool trousers, and his heaviest, down-filled parka, the one reserved for the worst days of winter. He tugged a warm hat over his ears and wrapped a scarf around his neck, tucking it into the collar of the coat. He pulled on thick, insulated gloves. Lastly, he sat on the bench by the door and forced his feet into heavy, waterproof boots, the effort leaving him slightly breathless. He felt less like a man going for a walk, and more like an Arctic explorer preparing for a doomed expedition. He grabbed a powerful, heavy-duty flashlight from the mantel, even though it was only mid-afternoon. The sky was so dark with storm clouds that dusk seemed to have already fallen. He clipped a lead onto Buster's collar. "I hope you know what you're doing, my friend," Elias said, looking down at the dog. Buster looked up at him, his eyes clear and certain. He knew. Elias took a deep breath, his hand on the doorknob. He was a man of science, a man who believed in evidence and reason, and he was about to step into a raging blizzard in sub-zero temperatures, following his arthritic dog in search of a sound that was almost certainly a trick of the wind. It was, by any logical measure, an act of sheer madness. But as he looked into Buster's trusting, determined eyes, he knew it was the only thing he could do. He opened the door, and the storm roared in, a physical assault of wind and ice. Elias leaned into the gale, his old frame braced against the fury, and followed his dog out into the white, unforgiving chaos. The moment they cleared the shelter of the cabin's porch, the storm hit them with the force of a physical blow. The wind shrieked, driving shards of ice and snow into every exposed inch of Elias's face. The world dissolved into a churning, blinding chaos of white. Visibility was less than 5 feet. For a terrifying moment, Elias felt a wave of panic, a dizzying sense of disorientation. It would be lethally easy to get lost out here, to become just another frozen mound in the landscape. But Buster was a rock in the storm. The old dog, who moments before had been groaning with the effort of standing up, seemed to have been reborn in the blizzard. He lowered his head, his great nose skimming the surface of the snow, and pulled on the lead with a strength and purpose Elias hadn't felt in years. This was his element. This was the work he had been born to do. Elias had no choice but to trust him completely. He held tight to the leash, his lifeline, and followed the determined bloodhound into the white abyss, his powerful flashlight beam cutting a weak, temporary tunnel through the swirling snow. They did not go far. Buster led him not deep into the woods, but along the edge of his property line, towards the crumbling stone wall that marked the boundary of the old, abandoned mountain chapel. The chapel hadn't been used in half a century, its roof long since collapsed, leaving only the stoic, defiant stone walls. It was a place of ghosts and memory, a landmark Elias passed on his walks but rarely gave a second thought. As they neared the wall, Buster became more frantic. He veered towards a section where the stones formed a small, sheltered alcove, protected from the main force of the wind. Here, the snow had drifted into a deep, soft pile. Buster began to dig, his powerful front paws sending sprays of snow into the air, his whining now a series of sharp, desperate yelps. "What is it, boy?" Elias shouted over the wind, his heart sinking. He feared the dog had found what he'd initially suspected, the body of some unfortunate animal that had succumbed to the storm. "What have you found?" He swept the beam of his flashlight over the snowdrift where Buster was digging. The light caught the edge of something dark and woven, sticking out of the white powder. It was a basket, a simple, wicker laundry basket, and from within the basket, muffled by the snow and the thin blanket covering it, came the sound. It was no longer a phantom on the wind. It was real. It was tangible. And it was the unmistakable, heartbreaking sound of a baby's cry, weak and fading. Time seemed to stop. The roar of the blizzard faded to a distant hum. Elias's mind refused to process what his eyes were seeing and his ears were hearing. With hands that trembled inside his thick gloves, he fell to his knees in the snow beside his dog. He brushed the snow away from the basket, his movements clumsy with a mixture of dread and awe. He lifted the thin, damp blanket. Inside, nestled in the center of the basket, was a baby, a newborn. Her face was a terrifying shade of mottled red and blue, her tiny fists clenched, her body wrapped in nothing more than a thin hospital-issue receiving blanket. She was so small, so impossibly fragile against the vast, brutal indifference of the storm. The doctor in him took over instantly. He pulled off a glove and pressed 2 fingers against the side of the baby's neck. The skin was shockingly cold, like touching marble, but beneath his fingers, he felt it. A pulse. Thready. Weak. But there. He watched her tiny chest and saw the shallow, almost imperceptible rise and fall. She was alive. Against all logic. Against all odds. In the heart of a killer storm, a baby lay abandoned in the snow. And she was alive. Elias stared at the impossible miracle before him. The questions could wait. Who she was. Where she came from. Who could have committed such a monstrous act? None of it mattered in this moment. All that mattered was the tiny, flickering flame of life that was threatening to be extinguished with every passing second. With a surge of purpose that sent adrenaline coursing through his old veins, he gently lifted the tiny, freezing bundle from the basket. He unzipped his parka, tucking the baby against the warm layers of his own body, shielding her from the wind. "Come on, Buster," he commanded, his voice thick with a new, fierce urgency. "Home. We have to go home. Now." He turned his back on the empty basket and the lonely chapel and began the desperate journey back to the cabin, carrying the most precious and inexplicable burden of his entire life. The journey back to the cabin, though short, was a desperate, stumbling battle against the storm. The wind tore at the precious bundle Elias clutched to his chest, and he hunched his old body over it, turning himself into a human shield. Buster stayed close, a steady, furry presence at his heels, as if guarding their retreat. The moment the cabin door shut behind them, sealing out the blizzard's roar, a new and more urgent battle began. The quiet, lonely home of a retired man transformed into an emergency room. The dusty, peaceful air became charged with clinical intensity, and Dr. Elias Vance, the man who had spent the last 5 years quietly reading and waiting for his own end, ceased to exist. In his place was the physician he had been for 40 years, sharp, decisive, and completely in command. "All right, little one," he murmured, his voice a low, focused hum. "Let's get to work." He laid the baby on the thick sheepskin rug before the fire, the same one Buster had occupied moments before. His hands, which had trembled with age and cold, were now impossibly steady. He stripped away the thin, damp hospital blanket. The baby's skin was a frightening waxy white, tinged with a deathly blue. She was barely breathing. His training took over, a flood of knowledge and experience washing away all other thoughts. He knew direct, intense heat like a hot bath would be a fatal shock to her system. The rewarming had to be slow, passive, and gentle. He grabbed a stack of clean, dry towels he kept warming by the hearth and gently patted her skin dry. Then, he stripped off his own outer layers until he was down to his soft flannel shirt. He lay down on the rug beside the infant and carefully gathered her up, tucking her tiny, cold body directly against his own chest. He pulled several thick, dry blankets over both of them, creating a cocoon of shared warmth. Skin-to-skin contact. It was the best and oldest method. Buster seemed to understand. The old dog limped over and lay down on the other side of the baby, pressing his warm, furry mass against the blankets. Adding his own considerable body heat to the effort, he let out a low, rumbling groan, a sound of profound concern, for what felt like an eternity. Elias lay there, the only sounds being the crackle of the fire, the howl of the wind, and the faint, shallow whisper of the baby's breath. He monitored her constantly, his fingers checking the pulse at her neck, his eyes watching for any change in her skin color. He was no longer a lonely old man in a cabin. He was a doctor on duty. His entire being narrowed to a single, critical task, fighting death. And as he worked, something deep inside him that had been dormant for years began to stir. It was a feeling he had almost forgotten, the fierce, brilliant spark of purpose, the adrenaline, the weight of a life in his hands. The silence he had grown so accustomed to was not a peaceful quiet, he realized, but the silence of a life without meaning. This tiny, fragile creature had shattered that silence and filled his world with a terrifying, wonderful, life or death imperative. He hadn't felt this alive since Martha was by his side. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, his efforts began to pay off. The frightening blue tint on the baby's lips and hands began to recede, replaced by a pale pink. Her skin lost its waxy, cold texture and began to feel like the skin of a living child. Her breathing deepened, becoming more regular. He knew the next step was critical. She needed calories. He managed to sit up, still holding her bundled against his chest, and prepared a small amount of infant formula with warm water, a canister he kept in the back of his pantry for emergencies. Getting her to drink was a battle of patience. Her sucking reflex was weak, almost non-existent, but Elias was endlessly patient, gently coaxing her mouth with the nipple of the bottle, squeezing a single drop at a time onto her lips until, finally, she began to take small, weak swallows. After she had taken a precious ounce of the warm liquid, she stirred. Her tiny face screwed up, and she let out a cry. It wasn't the weak, fading wail he had heard in the snow. This cry was louder, more robust. It was the sound of a fighter. It was the sound of life. Elias looked down at the tiny, squirming bundle in his arms, a wave of profound, exhausted relief washing over him. The storm still raged outside, but inside this cabin, a different kind of storm had been weathered. A life had been saved, and in saving her, he had the distinct feeling that he had just begun to save himself. The storm broke with the dawn, leaving a world of pristine, sculpted white in its wake. The sun rose into a brilliant blue sky, casting long, dramatic shadows across the snow-covered landscape. Inside the cabin, a fragile peace had settled. The baby, her immediate crisis averted, was sleeping soundly in a makeshift crib, a sturdy drawer from an old dresser, lined with Elias's softest wool sweaters. Elias, who had not slept, sat in his armchair, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of her tiny chest. The exhaustion he felt was profound, but it was overshadowed by a protective vigilance. The immediate medical emergency was over, but the great lachi, waindi, laki iwachiayot, maik, moriwan waxistais, muster susti inraras, wai. Of her existence was just beginning. Who was she, and who was the monster who had left her to die? He turned his attention to the few items she had been found with, which he had laid out on his coffee table. There was the cheap wicker basket and the thin, standard-issue hospital receiving blanket. They told him nothing. They were anonymous, disposable. But as he carefully refolded the blanket, his fingers caught on something tucked deep within its folds. It was a handkerchief. Unlike the blanket, it was made of fine, high-quality linen, its edges delicately hemmed. It felt impossibly soft against his rough fingers. And in one corner, embroidered with a skillful, elegant hand in pale blue thread, was a single name, Lily. Elias stared at the name, his heart giving a sudden, powerful lurch. Lily. She was no longer just the baby or the infant. She was a person. She had a name. He looked over at the sleeping child, a wave of tenderness washing over him. Hello. Lily, he thought. The name gave him focus. With a living, breathing, named child in his home, his duty was clear. He could no longer delay involving the authorities. With a heavy sigh, he picked up the phone and dialed the number for the Northwood Sheriff's Department. Sheriff Miller arrived within the hour, his 444 cruiser the first vehicle to brave the newly plowed mountain road. He was a young man, not yet 40, with a sharp, intelligent face and the weary eyes of someone who had seen more than his share of small-town trouble. But as he stepped into the cabin and saw the makeshift crib by the fire, his professional demeanor cracked with stunned disbelief. Good God. Elias, he breathed, taking off his hat. The dispatcher said you'd found a baby, but I didn't believe it. Elias recounted the story in his calm, clinical way, the dog's insistence, the discovery by the old chapel, the desperate fight against hypothermia. He showed Miller the basket and the handkerchief. Sheriff Miller listened intently, his expression growing grimmer with every word. He knelt by the crib and looked at the sleeping infant, his face a mixture of pity and a cold, rising anger. To do this, to leave a child out in that, it's not human. He stood up. All business now. Do you have any idea who she is? Only what's on the handkerchief, Elias said. Lily. The sheriff nodded and began the official process. He took photographs of the basket, the blanket, and the handkerchief. He got on his radio and requested a search of all state and regional databases for missing infants. He called the county hospital to see if any recent births had gone unaccounted for. The results that came back over the next hour only deepened the mystery. There were no missing children named Lily. No Amber Alerts had been issued. The local hospital had all its mothers and babies accounted for. No one in Northwood or the surrounding communities was known to have been pregnant and due to give birth. It was as if Lily, and whoever had abandoned her, had simply dropped from the sky. This makes no sense, Miller said, pacing the small cabin. A baby doesn't just appear. Someone knows something. He looked at Elias, a new level of respect in his eyes. You saved her life, Doc. No question about it. For now, she's safest here with you. Social services would just stick her in a generic facility, and I don't think she'd survive that right now. He prepared to leave, but paused at the door. We'll find them. Elias, he said, his voice hard. Whoever did this, we'll find them. People don't get away with this kind of evil. Not in my county. With that promise hanging in the air, the sheriff departed, leaving Elias alone once more with the sleeping baby and the loyal old dog. He now had a name, but the mystery was larger and more monstrous than ever. Who was Lily, and what desperate, tragic story had led her to his door? The days following Sheriff Miller's visit unfolded in a surreal, exhausting rhythm, governed by the relentless demands of a newborn. Elias's quiet, ordered life of books and contemplative silence was shattered, replaced by a cycle of 2-hour feedings, makeshift diaper changes, and the constant low-level anxiety of caring for such a fragile life. Lily, though safe from the immediate danger of the storm, was still perilously weak. She was prone to fits of crying, a thin, fretful sound that seemed to echo the profound sorrow of her arrival. Elias, despite his medical knowledge, often found himself at a loss. He would rock her, check her temperature, feed her, burp her. But sometimes the crying would continue, a heartbreaking expression of a pain he couldn't diagnose or treat. The physical and emotional toll was immense. Sleep became a forgotten luxury, snatched in 20-minute increments in his armchair. His old bones ached, and a weariness settled deep within him. There were moments, in the dead of night, when he would look at the tiny, wailing infant and feel a wave of overwhelming doubt. What was he doing? He was a 72-year-old man. He wasn't equipped for this. He was failing her. Throughout it all, Buster remained a steadfast, silent observer. The old dog rarely left the main room of the cabin. He would watch Elias with his wise, soulful eyes, his head cocked as if listening to Lily's cries with a physician's ear. He seemed to be a partner in Elias's vigil, a silent source of support. The moment that would change everything happened on the third night. It was the worst night yet. Lily had been crying for over an hour, a relentless, inconsolable wail. Elias had tried everything. He was exhausted, his nerves frayed raw, his own grief mingling with a feeling of helpless frustration. He had placed Lily back in her drawer crib by the fire, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "I don't know what else to do for you, little one," he whispered, his voice hoarse with fatigue, as if these were the words he had been waiting for. Buster acted. With a deep groan of effort that spoke of his aching, arthritic hips, the old dog pushed himself to his feet. He hobbled over to his own bed, a thick, orthopedic cushion that Elias had bought to ease his old friend's pain. Buster nudged it with his nose, then clamped his great, jowly mouth onto one corner of the heavy cushion, and with a determination that was breathtaking to behold, he began to drag it across the wooden floor. His back legs trembled with the strain, and he had to stop every few feet to rest, panting heavily. But he did not stop. Inch by painstaking inch, he dragged his bed across the room until it was directly alongside the drawer where Lily lay crying. Elias watched, completely stunned into silence. Buster then laboriously lowered himself onto the floor, his old bones creaking, and pressed his large, warm body against the side of the makeshift crib. He laid his great head down on his paws, his nose just inches from the baby. Lily's crying hitched, her wails softening to whimpers, as she seemed to sense the new, warm presence. Then, Buster did something truly extraordinary. A deep, low rumble began in his chest. It was not a growl of aggression. It was a soft, vibrating groan, a sound like the purr of a great engine, a sound of pure, profound comfort. He lay there, a furry, breathing radiator. And every time Lily let out a small, fretful whimper, he would answer with that deep, comforting rumble. Miraculously, it worked. The baby's whimpers subsided. Her tiny, rigid body began to relax. She turned her head towards the warmth and the sound. Within minutes, she had settled into a deep, peaceful sleep for the first time since her arrival. Elias stared, his eyes filling with tears that had nothing to do with his own sorrow. He was witnessing an act of pure, unadulterated empathy, a display of compassion so profound it transcended species. This wasn't just an animal's instinct. This was a choice. This was love. Buster had not just found the baby in the snow. He had claimed her. She was part of his pack, his to protect. A renewed strength flooded through Elias's weary body. He was not alone in this fight. He looked at the three of them, a lonely old man, a fragile, abandoned baby, and the ancient, loyal dog who had appointed himself her guardian. They were an absurd, impossible family. But in that moment, in the warm, firelit cabin, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. A week passed in quiet solitude. A new routine, gentle and sacred, established itself within the four walls of the cabin. It revolved around Lily's needs and was guarded by the unwavering devotion of Buster. The old dog had appointed himself as Lily's personal guardian. He slept by her makeshift crib. He watched with a critical eye as Elias changed her, and his deep, rumbling groan became the go-to remedy for any infant fussiness. The bond between the fragile baby and the ancient dog was a silent, powerful miracle that Elias witnessed with daily awe. Elias himself felt like a man rediscovering a forgotten language. The clinical skills of caring for an infant returned easily, but it was the language of the heart, the soft murmurs and gentle rocking, that felt both alien and deeply familiar. He was tired, but it was a good purposeful exhaustion. A world away from the hollow weariness of grief. But beneath the surface of this peaceful domesticity, the dark mystery of Lily's origin was a constant, unsettling presence. Sheriff Miller returned on a crisp, clear morning, the sunlight glinting off the snow on his boots. He looked tired and frustrated. He accepted a cup of coffee from Elias and sat heavily at the small kitchen table. "It's a ghost hunt, Elias," the sheriff said, running a hand over his weary face. "I've put out bulletins in 3 states, checked every hospital, every clinic, every police report for 100 miles in every direction. Nothing. It's like she dropped out of the sky. No missing mothers, no missing babies. It's a complete and total dead end." Elias looked over at Lily, who was sleeping peacefully, her tiny hand curled around Buster's ear. Someone, somewhere, knows she exists. "Well, they aren't talking," Miller said grimly. "So I started looking at it from another angle. I pulled all incident reports from the 2 days leading up to the storm. Accidents, disturbances, anything out of the ordinary on any of the mountain passes in the region." He paused and took a sip of his coffee. "And I found something. It's probably nothing. A long shot. But the timing is coincidental." Elias leaned forward, his attention sharp. "What is it?" "A car crash," the sheriff said. "Single vehicle. Went off the road on the far side of Black Ridge, about 60 miles from here. Happened the day before the blizzard really hit. The road was already getting icy." "Was there a fatality?" Elias asked, his doctor's mind kicking in. Miller nodded. "A young woman. Name of Amelia Croft. 24 years old." He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. It was a printout of a brief news article from a city paper. From a wealthy family down in the city. An heiress, it seems. The article says she was up here looking at some property. Elias felt a strange, cold prickle on the back of his neck. The kind of intuitive warning that had served him well for decades as a diagnostician. "Was there anyone else in the car?" Elias asked. "No. She was alone," Miller said, anticipating his next question. "And before you ask, I checked the M.E.'s report and the family's statement to the press. The official record is clear. Amelia Croft had no husband and no children." The sheriff sighed, folding the paper. "Like I said, it's a dead end. Just a tragic accident. The timing is a coincidence, that's all." Elias was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant. He was a man of science, a man who dealt in facts and evidence, and the facts stated that the dead woman had no child. But a lifetime of experience had taught him that facts were sometimes just the surface of a much deeper truth. The timing was too perfect. A young woman dies alone on the mountain, and hours later, a newborn baby appears, as if from nowhere. "Maybe," Elias said slowly, his voice thoughtful. "Or maybe the official record is wrong." Miller looked at him, skeptical. The family was clear. "Elias, an accident is a chaotic event." "Tom," Elias reasoned, his mind working through the possibilities. "But what happened to Lily? That wasn't chaos. That was a deliberate act. Someone carried that basket to the old chapel. Someone placed her in the snow. Someone made a choice to let her die." He looked at the sheriff, his eyes sharp. Maybe the family is wrong. Or maybe they're lying. The accusation hung in the air, audacious and unproven, but it planted a seed of doubt in the sheriff's mind. He looked from the determined old doctor to the sleeping baby, and he knew this case was far from a dead end. It was just beginning. Sheriff Miller left the cabin with Elias's words echoing in his ears. Maybe they're lying. It was a bold, almost reckless accusation to level against a family in mourning. A family with the kind of wealth and influence that could make a small-town sheriff's life very difficult. His professional training urged caution. telling him to stick to the facts. The facts said Amelia Croft had no children. But Elias Vance was not a man given to wild flights of fancy. He was one of the most logical and respected men in the county. And Miller's own gut, a finely tuned instrument for detecting deceit, was now humming with a low, persistent unease. Back in his quiet, wood-paneled office, he stared at the printout of the news article. It named Amelia's surviving family her stepfather, Robert Hayes, a prominent investment banker, and his wife, Eleanor. They had raised Amelia since she was a small child, after her father, a wealthy tech entrepreneur, had passed away. By all accounts, they were pillars of their city's high society. Miller knew what he had to do was a risk. A direct call to a powerful, grieving family based on nothing more than a gut feeling was unorthodox. But the image of that tiny baby, Lily, sleeping peacefully under the watchful eye of an old dog, spurred him on. He decided on a pretext. He would call under the guise of closing out his report on all storm-related incidents in his jurisdiction. A routine follow-up. He dialed the number listed for the Hayes residence. A man with a smooth baritone voice answered. "Hayes. Mr. Hayes. This is Sheriff Miller from Northwood County. I do apologize for the intrusion during this difficult time. I'm calling regarding your stepdaughter's accident." Yes. The voice was clipped, impatient, with no trace of warmth or grief. "I was told the local authorities had concluded their work." "We have, sir," Miller said, choosing his words carefully. "I'm just finalizing the paperwork. Forgive me for asking, but I need to be thorough. The report states your stepdaughter was traveling alone. We can confirm that she had not checked into any local hotels or inns with a companion." There was a sigh on the other end of the line, a sound of pure, unadulterated annoyance. "Sheriff, my stepdaughter was a free spirit. Her travels were her own business. But she was most certainly alone. There was no one. Now for the leap." "I understand, sir. And again, my apologies for the delicate nature of this question. But for the official record, we must confirm that there was no possibility she was traveling with a child or that she had recently given birth." The silence that followed was instant and absolute. It was a cold, heavy silence, so profound that Miller thought the line had been disconnected. When Robert Hayes finally spoke, his voice was no longer just impatient. It was sharp, defensive, and laced with a venom that was startling. "That is an outrageous and offensive question. What are you implying?" Sheriff Amelia was troubled, yes, but she was not that kind of girl. There is no child. There never was. Her death was a tragedy, and we would appreciate it if you would allow our family to grieve without being subjected to these morbid fantasies. In the background, Miller heard a woman's sharp, cutting voice. "Robert, what is it? Hang up the phone. We have nothing more to say to these people. I have lawyers handling my stepdaughter's estate," Robert Hayes said, his voice now a dismissive snarl. "Any further communication can go through them. Goodbye, Sheriff." The line went dead. Sheriff Miller slowly placed the receiver back in its cradle. He leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He had been a cop for 15 years. He knew what grief sounded like. It sounded like shattered voices, choked sobs, confusion, and pain. It did not sound like that. That was the sound of cold fury. That was the sound of annoyance at an inconvenient question. That was the sound of a man far more concerned with his lawyers and his stepdaughter's estate than with the memory of the girl herself. That was the sound of a family with something to hide. Elias Vance was right. He picked up the phone again, his course of action now crystal clear. His investigation was no longer a broad search for a missing mother. It was now sharply, intensely focused on the cold, grieving family of Amelia Croft. He dialed Elias's number. "Elias," he said. The moment the old doctor answered, "It's Tom. You were right. Something is very, very wrong with this picture." Sheriff Miller's call solidified the uneasy alliance between the old doctor and the young lawman. They were no longer just dealing with an abandoned child. They were circling a dark secret, one that a wealthy and powerful family was desperate to protect. But their conviction was built on the flimsy foundations of a cold phone call and a gut feeling. They had no proof, no evidence to challenge the official story. "I'll start digging into the Hayes family's financials. See if anything shakes loose," Miller had promised before hanging up, but I'll have to be careful. In the meantime, you just keep taking care of that little girl. You're all the protection she has. Life in the cabin continued its peaceful rhythm, an island of tranquility in a sea of unknown danger. Elias found his days filled with a simple, profound purpose. He sterilized bottles. He learned the perfect temperature for warming formula. He discovered that Lily was soothed by the low, classical music he played on his old record player. Buster remained her constant, furry shadow, a guardian whose devotion never wavered. It was during one of these quiet domestic moments that the case broke wide open. Elias was folding the laundry he had washed the day before. Among the clothes was the thin, cheap receiving blanket that Lily had been wrapped in when he'd found her. He had washed it thoroughly, and as he smoothed it out, his sharp eyes, trained for decades to notice the smallest anomaly on a medical chart or an X-ray, caught something he had missed before. Sewn discreetly into the hem, almost invisible against the white fabric, was a small, secondary tag. It wasn't a manufacturer's tag. It was thin, made of a durable, papery fabric, the kind used by professional laundry services to track linens for large institutions. Most of the print had been washed out, faded to a pale, illegible gray. Curious. He took the blanket to the large magnifying lamp on his reading desk. He angled the light just so, his old, steady hands holding the fabric taut. Under the powerful magnification, faint lettering became visible. It was the name of a laundry service, and below it, the name of their client. Rosewood Birthing Center. Elias stared at the words, his heart beginning to pound a heavy, rhythmic beat against his ribs. The Rosewood Birthing Center. The name sounded exclusive, expensive. Why would a baby, abandoned in a cheap blanket and a wicker basket, be connected to such a place? It made no sense. Unless the blanket wasn't the important part. Unless the baby was. He immediately called Sheriff Miller, his voice electric with an excitement he hadn't felt in years. Tom, I have something. It might be nothing, but it feels like something. The blanket the baby was in. There's a laundry tag on it. For a place called the Rosewood Birthing Center. Never heard of it, Miller said. Probably some small local clinic. I don't think so, Elias insisted. The name, it sounds high-end. Could you run a search on it? Find out where it is. On it, the sheriff said, and Elias could hear the clacking of a keyboard over the phone. He waited, his breath held. After a moment, the sheriff let out a low whistle. Okay, Elias, you were right. This is definitely something. What is it? Elias pressed. The Rosewood Birthing Center is a private, luxury maternity clinic, Miller said, his voice now tight with excitement. One of the most exclusive and discreet facilities in the entire state. It's known for catering to the wealthy, to celebrities, to anyone wanting absolute privacy. He paused for dramatic effect. And, Elias, it's located in the city. The same city where Amelia Croft lived and where the Hayes family resides today. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The connection was no longer just a gut feeling. It was a physical link, a thread, however thin, that tied the abandoned baby in his cabin directly to the dead heiress and her cold, grieving family. The official story was that Amelia Croft had no child, but Elias was now holding the evidence that suggested she had been in a maternity clinic, a place where babies are born. The discovery of the laundry tag was like a key, turning in a long-rusted lock. It transformed the investigation from a shot in the dark into a focused, targeted inquiry. Sheriff Miller now had a tangible link, however tenuous, between the dead heiress and the baby in Elias's cabin. It gave him the leverage he needed to push harder. He knew that questioning the Hayes family directly would be fruitless. They would stonewall him with a wall of high-priced lawyers. So he took a different approach. He started digging into the one thing a powerful family couldn't completely control: public records. He spent the next day on the phone with clerks at the county probate court in the city, searching for the last will and testament of Amelia Croft. His initial search turned up exactly what he expected. A will had been filed by the Hayes family's prestigious law firm the day after Amelia's funeral. It was a simple, straightforward document, leaving her personal effects to her stepfather and her considerable assets to a charitable foundation. A foundation, Miller noted with a cynical twist of his lips, whose board of directors was chaired by one Robert Hayes. It was all neat and tidy. Too tidy. Miller's gut instinct, the one that had served him so well over the years, screamed that he was missing something. He asked the clerk to run another search, a broader one, for any and all legal documents filed by Amelia Croft in the last year. For an hour, there was nothing. Then, the clerk called back, her voice hesitant. "Sheriff, I found something else. It's unusual." "What is it?" Miller asked, leaning forward in his chair. "It's another will, sir. A holographic will, written in her own hand, but properly witnessed and notarized. It was filed just 1 week before her death by a small, independent legal aid lawyer, not by the family's big firm." Miller's heart began to beat faster. "Can you read it to me? I can do better than that." The clerk said. "The lawyer who filed it included a certified digital copy with the court. I'm emailing it to you now. You're going to want to sit down for this. Sheriff." A moment later, a file appeared in his inbox. Miller clicked it open. The document that filled his screen was the bombshell that blew the entire case wide open. It began with a single sharp sentence. "This document, being my final and definitive last will and testament, hereby revokes any and all previous wills." Miller scrolled down, his eyes widening as he read Amelia's own words, written in a clear, determined hand. She wrote of her deep and growing distrust for her stepfather, Robert Hayes, citing his predatory financial practices and his attempts to gain control of the trust her biological father had left her. She described her fear that her stepfamily saw her not as a daughter, but as a temporary custodian of a fortune they believed was rightfully theirs. And then came the final devastating clauses. "To my beloved, precious daughter, whom I have named Lily, I leave the entirety of my estate, including all properties, all stocks and bonds, and the entirety of the Croft family trust. It is my most fervent wish that she grow up safe, loved, and free from the avarice that has poisoned my own life." The will went on to name a new executor, a trusted childhood friend who was now a respected family law attorney. The Hayes family was not just disinherited. They were explicitly and completely cut out, with Amelia's reasons laid bare for the courts to see. Miller leaned back in his chair, a cold dread settling in his stomach. The motive was now illuminated in blazing, horrific detail. With Lily alive and this will in effect, the Hayes family would get nothing. But if the will were to be suppressed, and if the baby, the sole heir, were to disappear, the previous will would stand, and the entire Croft fortune would fall right into their waiting hands. They hadn't just abandoned a baby. They had attempted to erase a multi-million-dollar obstacle. The sheriff picked up the phone and dialed Elias's number, his hand unsteady. The old doctor answered on the first ring. "Elias," Miller said, his voice grim and shaken. "I have her will. The real one." He quickly summarized the document's shocking contents. He finished by reading the final, damning sentence from Amelia's own hand. He heard Elias draw a sharp, pained breath on the other end of the line. "We were wrong, Elias," the sheriff said, his voice low. "We thought we were dealing with simple greed. But this is a level of evil I can barely comprehend. We're dealing with monsters." The discovery of the will changed the very nature of the investigation. Sheriff Miller was no longer just a small-town cop looking for a missing mother. He was now standing at the edge of a conspiracy involving immense wealth, fraud, and, most likely, murder. The laundry tag from the Rosewood Birthing Center was no longer just a clue. It was a destination. He knew a phone call wouldn't be enough. This required a face-to-face meeting, leaving his deputies to coordinate with state agencies. Sheriff Miller drove the 2 hours to the city, the certified copy of Amelia's secret will sitting on the passenger seat like a loaded gun. The Rosewood Birthing Center was exactly as its name suggested. Less a hospital and more a luxury spa for the expecting elite. It was discreet, elegant, and protected by a formidable wall of privacy and high-priced administrators. Miller's initial inquiries were met with polite, unyielding resistance. "Patient confidentiality is our highest priority." "Sheriff," a stern-faced administrator told him, "we cannot release any information about our clients." Miller slid the copy of the will and a signed warrant across the polished mahogany desk. "Patient confidentiality ends where a potential homicide investigation begins," he said, his voice flat and cold. "I have reason to believe a baby born in this facility was abducted and left for dead. Now, I want a list of every nurse who attended to Ms. Amelia Croft during her stay. The administrator's composure faltered. An hour later, Miller was sitting in a quiet corner of a nearby coffee shop, across from a young nurse named Isabel. Her hands were trembling as she clutched her cup, her eyes wide with fear. "I can't talk about this," she whispered, glancing around nervously. "The Hayes family? They're powerful. They could ruin me." Miller leaned forward, his voice low and gentle. "I know you're scared, but I need you to listen." He took out his phone and showed her a picture Elias had sent him that morning. It was a photo of Lily, sleeping peacefully in her drawer crib, with Buster's great head resting protectively beside her. "This is Amelia's daughter," Miller said softly. "Her name is Lily. Someone left her in a basket to freeze to death in a blizzard, but a good man and his old dog found her. She's alive. Isabel. And she needs someone to tell the truth for her." Isabel stared at the photo, her eyes filling with tears. The image of the innocent child seemed to break through her wall of fear. She took a shuddering breath. She was so scared. The nurse whispered. Amelia Miller prompted gently. Isabel nodded. She was the sweetest patient. But she was terrified. She told me her stepfamily was trying to control her, that they only cared about her father's money. She said she had just written a new will to protect her baby, and that she had a lawyer she trusted. The nurse's eyes met his. She made me memorize the lawyer's name. She said, "If anything happens to me, Isabel, please, you have to call this number. Don't let my family near my daughter." A chill went down Miller's spine. It was a premonition from a dead woman. "Did you see the family at the clinic?" he asked. "Once," Isabel said, her voice dropping lower. "The day before Amelia was discharged. Her stepfather and stepmother came. I could hear them from the hallway. They were yelling. They called her ungrateful, a fool. They said she was throwing her life away. It was all about the money. It was so bad. I had to go in and ask them to leave." She paused, taking another shaky breath, as if bracing herself for the final damning piece of the story. When it was time for Amelia to go home, her stepfather, Mr. Hayes, insisted on driving her. His car was waiting out front. Amelia looked, petrified, but she didn't argue. Isabel's voice cracked. "Clinic policy is to escort the mother and baby to the vehicle. I carried Lily myself. I put her car seat in the back of Mr. Hayes's car. I watched them drive away." She looked at Sheriff Miller, her face pale with the weight of her memory. "That was the last time I ever saw her alive." The sheriff now had a witness who could place Amelia and her baby in the direct care of the man who stood to gain everything from their disappearance. Just hours before her car went off the side of a mountain, the drive back up the mountain felt different for Sheriff Miller. The puzzle pieces were no longer scattered. They were beginning to form a single, monstrous picture. He had motive, in the form of a secret will worth hundreds of millions. He had opportunity, with the nurse's testimony placing Amelia and her newborn directly into the hands of Robert Hayes just before her death. What he needed now was the final, irrefutable link. He needed to prove that the car crash was no accident. He called Elias as soon as he was back in his office, relaying the nurse's chilling story. The old doctor listened in silence on the other end of the line, the only sound his steady breathing. "So he drove her away," Elias said finally, his voice low and grim. "And somewhere between that clinic and her home, her car went off a mountain pass." "That's the story," Miller confirmed. "A man who would conspire to abandon a newborn in a blizzard to inherit a fortune is not a man who would leave murder to chance or coincidence." "Tom," Elias said, his diagnostic mind cutting through the legal complexities. "He wouldn't just hope for an accident. He would ensure it. You need to look at the car." Elias was right. A circumstantial case was strong, but physical evidence was better. This investigation was now far beyond the resources of his small county department. Armed with the nurse's sworn statement and a copy of Amelia's secret will, Sheriff Miller made a call to the state police headquarters and laid out the entire, sordid case. He was no longer a small-town sheriff on a hunch. He was the lead investigator on a conspiracy and probable homicide. The state authorities, seeing the powerful evidence, acted immediately. An order was issued to reopen the investigation into the death of Amelia Croft, the wreckage of her luxury sedan, which had been sitting under a tarp in a state police impound lot for weeks, was now the subject of intense new scrutiny. A team of top forensic mechanics from the state's crime lab descended on the vehicle. Elias and Sheriff Miller could do nothing but wait. The next 24 hours were agonizing. In the cabin, Elias focused on his routine with Lily, finding a small measure of peace in the simple, life-affirming tasks of feeding and rocking her. He knew that their quiet, peaceful future depended entirely on what the mechanics found in that wreckage. The call from Miller came late the next afternoon. Elias answered on the first ring. "They found it, Elias," the sheriff said. There was no triumph in his voice, only a weary, grim satisfaction. "They found it." "What was it?" Elias asked, his heart pounding. "The brake lines," Miller said. "They weren't ruptured from the impact. They weren't worn or faulty. They were cut, deliberately, expertly. The lead mechanic said it was a clean, professional job, done with a pipe cutter, designed to cause a failure after a few applications of the brake, so it would seem like an accident on a steep road. There would have been no way for her to stop. The final, horrific piece of the puzzle slid into place. It was murder, a cold, premeditated, and brutally executed plot to eliminate an inconvenient mother and her newborn heir. "The state police are taking the lead now," Miller continued, his voice all business. "They're getting warrants for the entire Hayes family, for financial records, phone records, everything. They're building an ironclad case." There was no more speculation. There was no more doubt. The official ruling of accidental death was being rescinded, and a new one was being written in its place: homicide. "It's over, Elias," Miller said. "It's just a matter of time now. We're going to get them." Elias looked over at Lily, who was cooing softly in her crib, reaching for a sunbeam that streamed through the cabin window. The monsters who had tried to erase her were about to be consumed by the very darkness they had created. Justice was no longer a hope. It was an inevitability. For the Hayes family, living in their opulent city mansion, the world had begun to tilt on its axis. The fortress of wealth and influence they had built around themselves was showing cracks. It began with polite but firm calls from their lawyers, reporting that state and federal investigators were now attached to the case of Amelia's accident. Then came the court orders, freezing their access to Amelia's accounts and demanding a vast array of their own financial records. The atmosphere in the house, once one of smug, cold satisfaction, curdled into one of thick, paranoid fear. The united front of the family began to crumble under the pressure. "I told you that leaving her in the wilderness was foolish, Eleanor Hayes," the matriarch hissed at her husband, her voice a venomous whisper. Her elegant, manicured facade had been replaced by a pinched, anxious fury. It was sloppy. Too many variables. "What else were we supposed to do?" Robert Hayes retorted, his usual blustering confidence gone, replaced by a sweaty, nervous pallor. "The will. She had already filed the new will. We had to make the baby disappear." The weak link in their chain of evil, however, was their son, Julian, a handsome, arrogant man in his late 20s. Julian was possessed of his parents' greed but none of their cunning. He was deep in gambling debt, and the promise of the Croft fortune had been his only way out. The legal freeze on the assets had sent him into a spiral of panic. "We have to do something," he insisted, pacing the length of their silk-draped living room. "We can't just sit here and wait for them to arrest us. I need money now." "Be silent, you fool," his mother snapped. "You will do nothing. Our lawyers will handle this. We will say the girl was unstable, that the will is a forgery." But Julian was not listening. Driven by desperation and an arrogant belief in his own cleverness, he decided to make a move. He possessed a document they had coerced Amelia into signing months before her death, a broad power of attorney. They had planned to use it to gain control of her finances, but her secret will had rendered it moot. Now, Julian saw it as his only key. He took the document to a private bank in the city where Amelia had kept a personal expense account, one separate from the main trust. Confident and smooth, he presented the power of attorney to a bank manager and requested a transfer of the account's entire balance, several $100,000, to his own name. "A formality, of course," Julian said with a charming smile, "just consolidating the family's assets during this difficult time." The bank manager, a calm, professional man, looked at the document. He looked at Julian. He nodded politely. Of course. Mr. Hayes, if you'll just take a seat for a moment, I'll have this processed for you immediately. The manager walked into a back office. He did not go to a terminal to process a transfer. He picked up his phone and dialed the direct line for the lead state police investigator on the Croft Hayes case. The bank had been alerted by Sheriff Miller's team days ago. They were ready. Julian sat in the plush leather chair, drumming his fingers impatiently, dreaming of the money that would solve all his problems. He was so lost in his greed that he didn't notice the two plainclothes detectives enter the bank and take up positions by the door. He didn't notice until the bank manager returned, flanked by the two detectives, his expression now one of cold formality. Julian Hayes, one of the detectives, said, "You're under arrest for attempted bank fraud and forgery." Julian's handsome face collapsed in a comical mask of shock and disbelief. He started to bluster, to threaten, to name-drop his family's powerful lawyers, but it was useless. They cuffed his hands behind his back and led him, struggling and protesting, out of the bank, in full view of the public. The first domino had fallen. Sheriff Miller received the call from the state police investigator a few minutes later. A slow, satisfied smile spread across his face. "They got him. Elias," Miller said when he called the cabin. "The son, Julian. He got greedy and tried to raid one of her accounts. Walked right into the trap." Miller paused. "They have him in an interrogation room now. A spoiled, weak-willed boy like that. He'll trade his own mother for a plea deal. It's all coming down now. Elias. It's finally coming down." Sheriff Miller's prediction proved correct. Julian Hayes was a bully and a coward, not a hardened criminal. In the stark, sterile environment of a state police interrogation room, stripped of his fine clothes and his family's influence, his arrogant facade crumbled within an hour. The detectives played him perfectly. They didn't open with the murder charge. They laid out the evidence for the bank fraud and forgery in open and shut case that would land him in federal prison for a minimum of 10 years. They showed him security photos of himself at the bank. They showed him the fraudulent document he had used. "This, you are not getting out of, Julian," the lead detective said, his voice calm and matter-of-fact. "This is a conviction. The only question now is whether you go down for this, or whether you go down for what your parents did to your stepsister." They offered him a deal, a chance to be a witness rather than a co-conspirator in a capital murder case. Faced with the certainty of prison and the terrifying abyss of a life sentence, Julian chose the path of the coward. He chose to save himself, and he confessed everything. The story he told, recorded on video, was a chilling tale of cold-blooded avarice. He painted his mother, Eleanor, as the mastermind. "It was always her," he said, his voice a pathetic whine. "She hated Amelia. She said Amelia was flaunting the Croft money. Money that should have been ours. When we found out she was pregnant, my mother, she said it was an unacceptable complication." He detailed how his stepfather, Robert, had paid their family's mechanic a substantial sum to expertly sever the brake lines on Amelia's car. They knew she was planning a trip to the mountains. They had timed it perfectly, hoping the icy roads in the remote location would make the crash look like a tragic, unavoidable accident. But the plan had gone wrong. Amelia had crashed, but she and the baby had somehow survived the initial impact, pulled from the wreckage by a passing motorist before the car was consumed by fire. When the Hayeses learned Amelia was alive and had given birth at the clinic, they had panicked. "We had to get the baby," Julian recounted, his eyes averted from the camera. "My mother said as long as the baby existed, the new will was valid. We went to the clinic to persuade Amelia, but she wouldn't listen." He described the argument and the drive away from the clinic. He confessed that they had driven Amelia's car, with her and the baby inside, to the far side of the mountain. "My father, he took the basket out of the car," Julian whispered, his voice barely audible. Amelia was screaming. He walked over to some old stone wall and set the basket down. He got back in the car. My mother told him to drive. "And Amelia," the detective asked, his voice low and dangerous. Julian began to sob. "She tried to fight him. After he left the baby, he made sure she couldn't follow. He made sure the accident was finished." It was a full confession. A confession to conspiracy, a confession to kidnapping. A confession to the murder of Amelia Croft and the attempted murder of her infant daughter, Lily. Armed with the videotaped statement, the state police descended on the Hayes mansion. The arrest was swift. There was no struggle. Robert and Eleanor Hayes, confronted with their son's betrayal and the irrefutable evidence against them, seemed to simply deflate. The power and arrogance that had defined them vanished, leaving only two pathetic, aging criminals. As they were led from their marble-floored foyer in handcuffs, their reign of quiet terror came to a final, ignominious end. Sheriff Miller called Elias as soon as the arrests were made. He relayed the grim details of the confession. "It's over, Elias," Miller said, his voice heavy with the weight of the story. "We got them. They confessed to it all." Elias stood in his warm, quiet cabin, the phone pressed to his ear. He looked across the room at Lily, who was sitting on the floor, giggling as she played with a set of wooden blocks. Buster was lying beside her, his head on his paws, watching her with adoring eyes. A wave of profound sorrow for Amelia, the mother she would never know, washed over him. But it was followed by a feeling of deep, somber peace. The monsters were caught. The world had been set right. Lily was safe. Forever. "Thank you, Tom," Elias said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for believing me." "Thank your dog, Elias," the sheriff replied. "He's the one who refused to let them get away with it." 1 year later, the mountain had shed its winter coat for the vibrant green of summer. The wildflowers bloomed in thick carpets across the meadows, and the air was warm and alive with the buzz of bees and the cheerful songs of birds. The little cabin on North Peak was no longer a silent sanctuary of grief, but a home filled with the sound of a child's happy babbling and the soft, thumping beat of an old dog's tail. The Hayes family was a dark memory, a story that had shocked the state. Their trial was swift. Faced with Julian's confession and the mountain of evidence against them, they were all found guilty. They would spend the rest of their natural lives in prison, their greed having bought them nothing but a cold cell. Lily's vast inheritance, now managed by the trustworthy lawyer Amelia had chosen, was safe and waiting for her. But the real story was not one of justice in a courtroom. It was one of life and love in the quiet cabin. Elias Vance was a man transformed. The weary retired doctor who had been quietly waiting for his life to end had found a new and profound beginning. His days were no longer measured by the turning of pages in a book, but by the milestones of a growing child. He had witnessed Lily's first smile, heard her first real giggle, and was now eagerly awaiting her first steps. The hollow ache in his heart, left by Martha's passing, had been filled by a love so fierce and protective it felt like the sun rising inside him. Lily, the baby who had been born into a conspiracy of death, was thriving. She was a happy, healthy toddler, with her mother's radiant smile and a delightful, curious nature. The terrifying first hours of her life were a scar she would never remember, erased completely by the unconditional love of her new father and her furry guardian. And Buster, the hero of the story, was enjoying the most glorious of retirements. He was 15 now, his movements slower than ever, his muzzle almost entirely white, but his eyes were bright, and his heart was full. He spent his days following Lily as she crawled across the cabin floor, acting as a furry, patient roadblock to keep her from tumbling off the porch. He was her guardian, her playmate, her living, breathing teddy bear. His great love, which had led him into a blizzard, now filled the small world they shared. After a lengthy but unopposed legal process, facilitated by Amelia's lawyer and endorsed by a deeply supportive Sheriff Miller, the adoption was made final. Dr. Elias Vance, at the age of 73, officially became Lily's father. One warm summer afternoon, the three of them were out in the small garden behind the cabin. Elias had started planting vegetables again, something he hadn't done since Martha passed. Lily was sitting in the soft grass, intently studying a ladybug on her finger. Buster lay nearby, snoozing in a patch of sun. Lily looked up, her face bright with a new idea. Pushing herself up with her chubby hands, she stood on wobbly legs. She took one hesitant step, then another. She was walking. Her first steps were not towards her father, but towards the sleeping old dog who had saved her. Elias watched, his breath caught in his throat, his eyes blurring with tears of pure, unadulterated joy. He was not just a witness to a child's first steps. He was a witness to the triumph of life over death, of love over evil. The sound on the wind, the impossible cry in the snow, had not been a phantom of his grief. It had been a call to duty, a call back to life. It had been the sound of his future, a future he never knew he wanted, delivered to his door by the unwavering heart of a very old, very good dog.